On the 14th of October in the year 1814, beneath a sky the colour of pewter and heavy with the promise of rain, Eleanor Whitmore walked alone across the moorland as she had done nearly every afternoon for the past 3 years, her brown wool cloak pulled tight against the autumn chill, and her practical boots leaving quiet impressions in the damp earth scattered with fallen leaves of amber and rust. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and by the cruel arithmetic of society, she had long since crossed the threshold from hopeful young woman into that pitied category known as spinster, a word that settled upon her shoulders like the grey afternoon itself, familiar and inescapable. Her features were plain, her figure unremarkable, and her position in the household of her wealthy aunt, Lady Beatrice Montague, was that of companion, which was merely a genteel way of saying servant without the honesty of wages fairly earned. Eleanor had learned years ago to make herself invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to occupy the smallest possible space in any room, and to expect nothing beyond the roof over her head and the meals placed before her. Yet even as she walked this path between Montague House and the distant towers of Ravenscroft Hall, something stirred within her that she could never quite suppress, a voice that narrated her own existence as though she were the heroine of a tale rather than its forgotten footnote. The moor stretched before her like an unwritten page, and in the privacy of her own mind, she painted it with words she would never speak aloud, imagining the heather as a purple sea and the distant hall as a castle where secrets slumbered behind ancient stones. She often told herself stories this way, populating her solitary walks with characters who lived the lives she never would, who spoke with boldness and loved with abandon, and mattered to someone, somewhere. Today she imagined a woman very like herself, who had been granted the gift of seeing what others overlooked, finding treasure in the discarded corners of the world, though even in her own fantasies Eleanor could not quite bring herself to grant the woman a happy ending, for that seemed too extravagant a fiction even for dreams. The wind picked up suddenly, carrying with it the distant thunder of hooves, and Eleanor paused on the path, shielding her eyes against the pale grey light to watch a rider approaching at reckless speed from the direction of Ravenscroft Hall. The horse was magnificent, a black stallion whose muscles rippled with power, and its rider sat tall in the saddle with the assured posture of a man accustomed to commanding both beast and world. She recognized the horse as Thunder, belonging to the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, that notoriously cold and private man whom she had glimpsed only from a distance at local assemblies where he never danced and rarely spoke. Then the unthinkable happened. The horse stumbled on the uneven ground, pitching forward with a terrible scream, and the rider was thrown from the saddle in a violent arc, his body striking the earth with a sound that seemed to echo across the empty moor. Eleanor was running before she knew her feet had moved, her cloak streaming behind her, her heart pounding against her ribs, racing toward the fallen figure who lay terribly, impossibly still upon the cold October ground. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. She reached him in what felt like hours, but could only have been moments, her breath tearing through her chest as she dropped to her knees beside the fallen Duke, her practical nature overriding the shock that threatened to render her as motionless as he appeared to be. Blood seeped from a wound at his temple, dark against the pallor of his skin, and his leg lay twisted at an angle that spoke of serious injury, yet it was the utter stillness of his chest that seized her heart with cold terror until she pressed her trembling fingers to his throat and felt the faint, precious flutter of life beneath the skin. "He is alive," she spoke aloud without meaning to, her voice carrying across the empty moor to no audience but the grey sky and the nervous stallion that paced nearby. and somehow the sound of her own words steadied her enough to act. She stripped off her brown wool cloak with hands that shook only slightly, and folded it into a pillow, lifting his head with more gentleness than she had ever shown another living soul, and settling it upon the worn fabric, watching the blood seep into the wool, and knowing she would never wear it again without remembering this moment. "You must hold on," she told him. Her voice low and urgent, as though he could hear her through whatever darkness held him captive. "Help will come, but you must hold on until it does." And she found herself narrating her actions as she checked his breathing and pressed her handkerchief to the wound at his temple, a habit born of lonely years spent talking to herself on these very moors. Deep within the prison of his own body, Henry Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, heard every word with a clarity that bordered on the miraculous, his mind fully alert, even as his limbs refused to obey his desperate commands to move, to speak, to signal that he was not the corpse he appeared to be. Terror unlike anything he had ever known gripped him as he realized he could not so much as flutter an eyelid, could not draw a deeper breath or turn toward the voice that fell upon his consciousness like light into a dark room, and he clung to that voice as a drowning man clings to driftwood. The rain began to fall then, soft at first, and then with greater insistence, and Eleanor bent over him to shield his face, still speaking in that steady stream of words about the help she would summon and the strength she could see in him, though how she could see anything in a man she did not know was a mystery even to herself. The servants from Ravenscroft Hall arrived within the half-hour, summoned by a groundskeeper who had witnessed the accident from afar, and with them came a woman in a blue velvet dress whose beautiful face hardened into something cold when her gaze fell upon Eleanor, kneeling blood-stained and rain-soaked beside her brother. "You may go now," Margaret Ashworth said, without a word of thanks, her eyes dismissing Eleanor as thoroughly as if she were a stray dog that had wandered too close. And though Eleanor rose obediently and stepped back, she felt the weight of the Duke's unhearing gaze upon her as they carried him away, never knowing that within his silent mind he was screaming for her not to leave him alone with voices far less kind than hers. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of whispered consultations and grave expressions, and Eleanor found herself drawn back to Ravenscroft Hall by forces she could not entirely name or explain, her aunt Lady Beatrice having insisted with unusual fervour that Eleanor make herself useful to the neighbouring household in their time of crisis, though Eleanor suspected this generosity had more to do with social advancement than genuine Christian charity. Dr. Samuel Ferrars, a kind-faced man with silver threading through his dark hair and spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose, had diagnosed the Duke with a deep unconsciousness from which he might never emerge, and when he learned that Eleanor had been present at the accident, he requested her assistance with a gentleness that took her quite by surprise. "The Duke's vital signs seem to steady when there are calm voices nearby," he explained, "and Miss Ashworth has neither the temperament nor the inclination for such vigils." And so Eleanor found herself installed in a worn leather chair beside the master chamber's great bed, surrounded by green velvet curtains that pooled like dark water against the polished floor, watching over a man she did not know, yet could not seem to abandon. Margaret Ashworth had agreed to this arrangement with a reluctance that bordered on hostility, her beautiful face arranged in an expression of martyred acceptance that fooled no one who cared to look closely, and Eleanor often caught the woman's cold gaze following her through the corridors, as though measuring her for some future reckoning. On the evening of October the 16th, Eleanor sat alone with the Duke for the first time, the household having retired early after days of exhausting worry, and the silence pressed upon her until she found herself speaking aloud simply to fill the emptiness of that grand and shadowed room. "I do not know if you can hear me, Your Grace," she said softly, her voice barely louder than the crackling of the fire in the hearth. "But I thought perhaps you might find some comfort in knowing you are not alone." And as she spoke, she noticed the faintest flutter of his eyelids. So brief, she dismissed it as a trick of the firelight dancing across his still features. Within the prison of his unresponsive body, Henry Ashworth clung to her words, like a man drowning in darkness who suddenly glimpses a distant shore, her voice the only proof he possessed that the world still existed beyond the terrifying silence of his own trapped mind. On the third day, while waiting for Dr. Faraz to complete his examination, Eleanor wandered into the Duke's library and discovered shelves upon shelves of poetry and literature that spoke of a man far different from the cold and unfeeling creature society believed him to be, and she selected a slim volume of verse that seemed well worn from frequent reading. That same afternoon, Lord Philip Sinclair arrived from London, his handsome face drawn with worry for his oldest friend, and Eleanor observed him watching over the Duke with a devotion that seemed at odds with everything she had heard about the supposedly friendless and forbidding master of Ravenscroft Hall. Meanwhile, in Margaret's private sitting room, Eleanor overheard fragments of a conversation that chilled her blood. Something about inheritance and timing and the necessity of acting before circumstances changed, though she hurried away before she could be discovered listening at doors like the servant Margaret clearly believed her to be. The evening of October 20th brought with it a storm that seemed determined to swallow Ravenscroft Hall whole. The wind howling against the windows like some beast demanding entry, while rain lashed the glass with a fury that made Eleanor grateful for the solid walls surrounding her and the single candle burning steady on the bedside table, its small flame casting dancing shadows across the Duke's still features as she settled into the worn leather chair that had become more familiar to her than any seat in her aunt's house. She had brought the slim volume of poetry she had discovered in his library, its pages soft with use and its margins occasionally marked with notes in a strong masculine hand that she had come to recognize as his, and she read aloud for nearly an hour, her voice weaving through verses about love and loss and the terrible beauty of the natural world until she reached the final page and found herself suddenly bereft of words that were not her own. The silence that followed felt oppressive, broken only by the storm's continued assault and the Duke's steady breathing, and Eleanor found herself speaking before she could think better of it, her voice dropping to something more intimate as she said, "I have run out of poetry, Your Grace, but I find I am not yet ready for silence, and perhaps you are not either. So I shall tell you a story of my own invention if you will permit me, though I suppose you have little choice in the matter." She laughed softly at her own presumption, a sound that seemed to startle her in the quiet room. And then she began to speak of a maiden who lived in a great house surrounded by people who looked through her as though she were made of glass, a girl who had learned to see beauty in the smallest things because the grandest things were never meant for her, who found magic in morning frost and poetry in the pattern of birds against a winter sky and whole universes in the pages of books that no one else bothered to read. Within the prison of his unresponsive body, Henry Ashworth felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries and everything to do with the woman whose voice painted pictures more vivid than any he had seen with his own eyes, and he found himself falling into her story as though it were a warm bath after years apart, her words touching places in his soul that he had long believed calcified beyond all feeling. She spoke of how the invisible maiden discovered she could capture the beauty others missed by writing it down, creating worlds on paper where she mattered, where her observations were treasures rather than oddities. And as Eleanor's voice grew softer and more confiding, Henry felt his finger twitch against the bedsheet, a movement so small it went unnoticed by the storyteller lost in her own tale, though somewhere deep in his struggling consciousness he recognized it as the first victory in what would become a long campaign to reach her. The midnight hour of October 25th found Eleanor alone once more in the Duke's chamber. The full moon casting silver light through the tall windows and painting pale stripes across the green velvet curtains, while she sat in her worn leather chair wearing the grey dress that had become her uniform of invisibility, the garment she donned each morning, as though its drab colour might somehow protect her from the notice of those who would find her presence here inappropriate or presumptuous. She had grown comfortable in these quiet hours when the household slept, and she could speak freely to the man who lay still as marble beneath his fine linens, his face illuminated by moonlight in a way that made him seem carved from something precious and eternal rather than flesh and blood. And tonight she found the words spilling from her lips before she could stop them. Confessions she had never spoken aloud to any living soul, tumbling forth as though his silence had created a space safe enough to hold her deepest secrets. "I write stories," she whispered, her fingers unconsciously touching the locket at her throat that held her mother's portrait. "Little tales that I hide beneath the loose floorboard in my chamber at my aunt's house, because I know they would think me foolish, or worse if they discovered them. And I have dreamed since I was a girl of seeing my words in print, though I know such dreams are not meant for women like me, plain women with no fortune and no prospects and nothing to recommend them but an imagination that refuses to be silenced, no matter how often I try to smother it." She told him then of her mother, a gentlewoman with kind eyes who had died when Eleanor was only 8 years old, leaving her in the care of a father who remarried within the year to a woman who saw Eleanor as nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of her husband's first love, and who had raised her own daughters to view Eleanor as a servant rather than a sister. "I learned to be invisible," she continued, her voice dropping even lower as tears she had not expected began to blur her vision. "I learned that wanting things only led to disappointment, and that the safest place for a girl nobody wanted was in the corners and shadows where no one thought to look. And yet here I am speaking to you as though you might actually care about the foolish dreams of a spinster who should have long ago accepted that her story would never be anything more than a footnote in someone else's tale." In the prison of his unresponsive body, Henry felt something warm slide down his temple and realized with distant wonder that he was crying, that this woman's pain had somehow reached through the walls he had spent a lifetime building and touched something raw and aching in his own heart. And when Eleanor noticed the moisture on his cheek, she leaned forward with a soft exclamation of concern and wiped it gently away with her fingertips, murmuring that it must be some reflex of the body, some meaningless physical response, never knowing that she had just touched the first tear the Duke of Ravenscroft had shed since his own mother's funeral 20 years before. Neither of them noticed the door that had opened a crack in the shadows, nor the pale face of Margaret Ashworth watching with narrowed eyes before slipping silently away into the darkness with new information to add to her growing arsenal. The afternoon of October 28th brought a reckoning that Eleanor had dreaded since the first moment Margaret Ashworth had looked upon her with those cold, calculating eyes, and it arrived in the form of a summons to Lady Beatrice's private sitting-room, where she found her aunt seated rigidly in her favourite chair, while Margaret stood by the window in a dress of deepest black that seemed designed to remind everyone of mortality and inheritance rather than genuine grief, her pale face arranged in an expression of wounded concern that did not quite reach her eyes as she turned to regard Eleanor with the sort of look one might give a particularly troublesome insect. "I have come to express my concerns," Margaret began, before Eleanor had even fully entered the room, "about the inappropriate attachment your niece has formed with my brother, and the liberties she has taken in speaking to him as though he were some village friend rather than the Duke of Ravenscroft. For I have heard that she tells him stories like some nursemaid entertaining a child, and I fear she may be taking advantage of his helpless state for purposes I dare not name, but which any person of sense might imagine. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as the words struck her like physical blows, each accusation a confirmation of every fear she had harbored about her own worthlessness. And she opened her mouth to defend herself, but found no words would come, only a terrible burning sensation behind her eyes that she desperately willed away. Lady Beatrice, however, proved unexpectedly formidable, rising from her chair with the sort of dignity that only decades of navigating society's treacherous waters could provide, and she fixed Margaret with a gaze that would have withered lesser opponents as she declared that her niece was performing a Christian duty at the request of the physician himself, and that any suggestion otherwise was both slanderous and beneath the dignity of a lady of Margaret's supposed breeding. The argument that followed seemed to last hours, though it was perhaps only minutes, voices rising and falling like waves against a shore, until Dr. Ferrars himself arrived, summoned by some servant who had sensed the conflict brewing, and his testimony proved decisive as he explained that the Duke's vital signs improved measurably when Miss Whitmore attended him, that his colour was better and his breathing stronger, and that whatever she was doing seemed to be the only treatment showing any effect at all. Margaret's face twisted briefly with something ugly before she composed herself, and swept from the room with a promise to revisit this conversation, leaving Eleanor trembling with her eyes red from tears she refused to shed in company. In his chamber above, Henry had heard every raised voice that penetrated through floor and wall, and the rage that consumed him at his sister's cruelty gave him strength he had not known he possessed, his hand clenching deliberately against the sheet, in a movement that Lord Philip Sinclair, sitting quietly in the corner where he had observed everything with growing concern, noticed with widening eyes, though he said nothing, merely tucking this information away like a card held close to the chest, waiting for the moment when it might prove most valuable. The evening of November the 2nd settled over Ravenscroft Hall like a velvet cloak, the fire crackling warmly in the hearth and casting dancing orange shadows across the walls of the master chamber, where Eleanor had drawn her worn leather chair closer to the Duke's bedside than she had ever dared before, close enough now that she could see the subtle movements behind his closed eyelids and the way his chest rose and fell with each breath. And she found herself speaking to him as she might speak to an old friend rather than a stranger whose voice she had never heard. "I have been thinking about you," she began, her words soft beneath the pop and hiss of the flames, about what people say of the Duke of Ravenscroft when they gather in drawing-rooms and whisper behind their fans. For I confess I made inquiries after the accident, curious about the man whose life I had stumbled upon on that grey October afternoon, and what I learned was that they call you cold and unfeeling, a man of stone who cares nothing for the hearts he might wound with his indifference. But I find myself wondering if perhaps they have mistaken stillness for emptiness and silence for cruelty. She rose then to tend the fire, adding another log and watching the sparks spiral upward like tiny stars, and behind her, unseen and unheard, Henry's hand closed slowly around the bedsheet with a deliberate strength that would have astonished any observer, his heart racing at her words, even as his body remained frustratingly unresponsive to his commands. "Let me tell you a story," Eleanor said as she settled back into her chair, pulling a blanket across her lap against the evening chill. "A tale of a prince who was cursed by a bitter enchantress to become as stone, unable to move or speak, or show the warmth that burned still in his heart, and all who looked upon him believed him cold and lifeless. A statue to be pitied or feared, but never loved. And so the years passed, and the prince remained trapped within his marble prison, watching the world through eyes that could not blink, and longing for the voice that might break through the silence that surrounded him." She wove the tale with the skill of one who had spent a lifetime escaping into imagined worlds, describing how the stone prince was passed over by beautiful princess who saw only his rigid exterior and never thought to look deeper, how servants whispered that he had no heart at all, how his own family began to speak of him as though he were already dead and gone. And Henry listened with tears he could not shed burning behind his eyes as he recognized his own life in her invented prince, his own reputation painted in her careful words, the loneliness that had defined his existence before her voice had become his reason to fight his way back to the living world. But there was one, Eleanor continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper as the fire crackled and snapped. One who came to sit beside him, not seeking anything for herself, one who spoke to him as though he might hear, and she alone saw past the stone to the man imprisoned within, and her voice became the chisel that slowly, imperceptibly, began to crack the enchantment that held him frozen. Lord Philip Sinclair, arriving quietly for his evening visit, paused in the doorway and noticed that the bedsheet near the Duke's hand was crumpled differently than before, and he filed this observation away with all the others, his hope growing stronger with each passing day. The morning of November 8th dawned grey and bitter, frost etching delicate patterns across the windows of Ravenscroft Hall, as Eleanor made her way through the corridors that had become as familiar to her as the passages of her aunt's house. Her hands roughened now from weeks of tending to the Duke, from wringing cloths and adjusting pillows, and performing the 100 small tasks that had somehow become the purpose around which her days revolved. And she had just reached the landing when she heard voices drifting up from the entrance hall below, one belonging to Margaret and the other to a man whose thin, nasal tones she did not recognize. Lord Carstairs had arrived that morning in a carriage of polished black lacquer, a thin and calculating figure, in a red waistcoat that seemed to glow like an ember against the grey November light. And Eleanor watched from the shadows as Margaret greeted him with a warmth she had never displayed toward anyone else in the household, her hand lingering on his arm as she guided him toward the drawing-room with promises of tea and important matters to discuss. Something in their manner set Eleanor's nerves on edge, a predatory quality to their movements that reminded her of foxes circling a henhouse, and she found herself creeping closer to the drawing-room door, her heart pounding with a guilt she could not quite explain, until she heard Margaret's voice rise clearly through the crack in the doorframe, saying that her brother would never wake, and that it was time to make arrangements for his care in a proper facility where professionals could tend to his vegetative state, while she assumed control of the estate, as was only right and natural. Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle her gasp, but it was the next words that truly wounded her. Margaret's voice dripping with contempt as she described the pathetic spinster who had attached herself to Henry's bedside like some desperate leech, telling him stories as though he were a child, and clearly harboring delusions above her station that would need to be firmly corrected once the proper papers were signed. The words struck Eleanor like physical blows, each one confirming every fear she had ever harbored about her own worthlessness, and she fled silently up the stairs, with tears burning in her eyes, not knowing that in his chamber above Henry had heard his sister's carriage arrive, and had been straining with every fibre of his being to listen, catching enough fragments through the floor to understand the danger, his fingers now moving deliberately beneath the sheets, as rage gave him strength he had not possessed before. And when Lord Philip Sinclair entered moments later and saw the Duke's eyes flutter open in a deliberate blink, once for yes and twice for no, he understood that his friend was fighting his way back, and that Margaret's schemes would soon crumble like autumn leaves beneath the first heavy frost of winter. The clock in the hallway had long since chimed 2 in the morning, when Eleanor finally allowed the last of her defences to crumble, exhaustion stripping away the careful walls she had built around her heart over 29 days of sitting beside a man who could not answer her. And tonight, her hair hung loose about her shoulders because she had not bothered to pin it up after her evening bath, an intimacy She would never have permitted herself if she had believed for one moment that anyone would see her, and the single candle on the bedside table had burned so low that the flame guttered and swayed with each breath she drew, casting flickering shadows across Henry's still features and illuminating the locket at her throat, where her mother's portrait lay hidden against her skin. "I have been foolish," she whispered into the darkness, her voice barely louder than the settling of embers in the hearth. "And I find that I can no longer pretend otherwise. Not to you who cannot hear me, and certainly not to myself who has spent a lifetime pretending not to want the things that other women take for granted. And the truth is that I have come to love you, Henry Ashworth, though I know how ridiculous those words would sound if anyone were awake to hear them. A spinster of 28, with rough hands and plain features, confessing her heart to a duke who has never heard her voice, and never will." She rose from her chair and moved closer to the bed, close enough to see the faint flutter of his eyelids that she had learned to recognize as some reflex of his damaged body, close enough to smell the lavender water Mrs. Fleming used to bathe him and the cedar of the furniture polish that kept his chamber gleaming, and she continued speaking as though the words had been dammed up inside her for years and could no longer be contained. "I know what I am," she said, her voice catching on the admission. "I am nothing, a poor relation kept on sufferance, a woman whom society has declared unworthy of love or consideration, and you are a duke, wealthy and powerful and handsome, even in sleep. And there is no world in which a man like you would look twice at a woman like me. But in this room, in this darkness where no one can see my shame, I can pretend that you might have listened, and might have cared, and might have seen something in me worth loving." She reached out then with trembling fingers and brushed the dark hair from his forehead, her touch feather-light and reverent. And before she could stop herself, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his brow in a kiss so tender it felt like a prayer, then fled the room with tears streaming down her cheeks, not seeing how Henry's grey-blue eyes flew open the moment the door closed behind her, not witnessing the single tear that traced down his cheek, or the way his lips moved soundlessly, trying to call her back. And when Dr. Ferrars entered moments later to check on his patient, he found those remarkable eyes open and aware before they fluttered closed again, leaving the physician to wonder if he had imagined the whole extraordinary thing. The afternoon of November the 15th brought the first snow of the season, delicate flakes drifting past the windows of Ravenscroft Hall like fragments of lace torn from some celestial gown, and Eleanor stood at the frost-rimmed glass, watching them fall, while Dr. Ferrars delivered news that should have filled her with joy, but instead sent ice through her veins, colder than any winter storm. "There are signs of improvement," the physician announced to the assembled household, his voice carrying the careful optimism of a man who had seen too many false dawns to promise anything with certainty. "The Duke's responses have grown stronger and more consistent over the past 3 days. He can squeeze hands now when prompted, and his eyes track movement with clear intention, and I believe we may see him wake fully within the fortnight if his progress continues at this remarkable pace." Margaret's face drained of colour at these words, her fingers tightening on the arm of her chair until her knuckles went white as the snow outside, and Eleanor watched the other woman's composure crack for just a moment before the mask slid back into place, smooth and cold as porcelain, though not before Eleanor caught the flash of something like panic in those calculating eyes. The days that followed were a study in contrasts as the household buzzed with cautious hope, while Margaret retreated to her chambers to write letter after letter to London solicitors, her quill scratching furiously across page after page that Lord Philip Sinclair intercepted and destroyed without a word to anyone save Mrs. Fleming, who had become his willing accomplice in protecting her beloved master from his own sister's machinations. Eleanor continued her vigil, but something had shifted in her manner, a careful distance creeping into her voice, where once there had been intimacy, and she no longer called him Henry in the quiet hours, but returned to formal address as though building walls against an inevitable abandonment, telling herself that when he woke he would be the Duke of Ravenscroft once more, and she would be nothing but the spinster who had presumed too much during his illness. Henry felt her withdraw like a physical wound, worse somehow than the injury that had trapped him in this prison of flesh. And he fought harder than ever to surface from the depths that held him, managing now to turn his head slightly on the pillow and to move his lips in shapes that were almost words, though no sound emerged to bridge the terrible distance she was placing between them. Dr. Ferrars noted with puzzlement that his patient's vital signs grew more agitated when Miss Whitmore spoke in that new, cool tone, his pulse racing and his breathing quickening as though in distress. And so he instructed her to read to him more, to speak as she had before, never knowing that his medical advice was torture for a woman trying desperately to protect her heart from shattering when the man she loved woke and looked through her as though she were invisible once more. The evening of November 20th arrived wrapped in the heaviest snowfall the county had seen in years, flakes falling so thick and fast that Eleanor could barely see the garden wall from the window of the Duke's chamber, and she stood there for a long moment, watching the world disappear beneath that relentless white blanket before turning back to the man who lay silent in his bed, her brown wool cloak wrapped around her shoulders, for the first time since that October afternoon when she had used it to cushion his broken body on the moor, and the sight of that familiar garment seemed to close a circle she had never intended to complete. Lady Beatrice had delivered the news just 3 hours before, with characteristic briskness, informing Eleanor that they would return to London in precisely 3 days, because the season's entertainments waited for no one, and surely the Duke's household could manage without Eleanor's assistance now that he showed signs of improvement, and Eleanor had simply nodded and retreated to this room one final time, knowing that she must say goodbye to a man who would never know she had been here at all. "I have one last story for you," she said softly, settling into the worn leather chair that had become more home to her than any room in Lady Beatrice's house. "And this one is the truest tale I have ever told, though I shall disguise it as fiction, because that is the only way I know how to speak of things that break my heart." She began weaving the narrative of a woman who wandered into an enchanted forest and found there a prince sleeping beneath a curse of silence. And this woman was plain and poor and possessed nothing of value except the stories she carried in her heart. And she sat beside that sleeping prince night after night, sharing those stories, until she fell hopelessly in love with a man who could never love her in return. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth as Eleanor's voice grew thick with unshed tears, and she described how the woman knew she must leave before the prince awakened, because she could not bear to see recognition dawn in his eyes followed by the inevitable dismissal, could not endure being looked through as though she were made of glass when she had grown accustomed to being seen, even if only in her imagination. And so she left, Eleanor whispered, her fingers reaching out to brush Henry's hand one final time. She left a book of poetry beside his bed because it was the most precious thing she owned, and she wanted him to have something beautiful to remember, even though he would never know who had given it to him, or why. And she walked out into the snow and disappeared and learned to live with the hollow place in her chest where her heart had once resided. She placed her mother's favorite book of verse on the bedside table and bent to press one final kiss to his forehead. And as she straightened and turned toward the door, Henry's lips parted, and from somewhere deep in his recovering throat came a single hoarse whisper that was swallowed by the crackling fire before it could reach her ears. The word "stay" hanging in the air like a ghost as she walked out without looking back, leaving him alone with his first spoken word in 37 days, echoing uselessly in the silence she left behind. The dawn of November 21st broke pale and cold over Ravenscroft Hall, the first rays of winter sun piercing through the frost-laced windows of the master chamber, where Henry Ashworth, Duke of Ravenscroft, opened his eyes fully for the first time in 38 days, and found himself staring at the green velvet canopy above his bed with complete clarity, his mind sharp and present, and burning with a single desperate thought that consumed every fibre of his slowly awakening body. Eleanor. Her name rose from his throat as a hoarse whisper, barely audible even in the silence of the early morning. But it was enough to bring Lord Philip Sinclair bolting upright from the chair where he had dozed through the night, having refused to leave his friend's side after witnessing the subtle signs of imminent awakening that the physicians had somehow missed. "Henry," Philip breathed, his voice cracking with emotion as he leaned forward to grasp his friend's hand. "Dear God, you are back with us at last." And Henry's fingers closed around Philip's with a strength that surprised them both as he struggled to form words through a throat unused to speech for over a month. "She cannot leave," Henry managed, each syllable costing him tremendous effort, but emerging with unmistakable urgency. "Eleanor Whitmore cannot leave this house, Philip. You must stop her. You must bring her to me before she goes." Philip's face shifted through a dozen expressions in rapid succession, from joy at his friend's recovery to concern at his agitation to something like wonder as the implications of Henry's words settled into understanding, and he nodded once with the decisive efficiency that made him such an excellent solicitor before squeezing Henry's hand and promising to fetch her immediately. But first there was Dr. Ferrars to summon, and the household to rouse, and Margaret to confront, for Henry had heard every scheming word his sister had spoken over the past weeks, and his first coherent sentences, after asking for Eleanor, were instructions to Philip regarding the legal documents and the planned declaration of incompetence, and the systematic dismantling of Margaret's treacherous plots. When Margaret swept into the chamber, still wearing the blue velvet dress that had become symbolic of her cold ambition, her face arranged in an expression of tearful relief that fooled no one present, Henry met her eyes with a gaze so piercing and so full of quiet fury that she stopped mid-step as though she had walked into an invisible wall. "I heard everything," he said simply, his voice growing stronger with each word, as though her presence fueled some deep well of determination. "Every conversation with Lord Carstairs, and every letter to London, and every cruel word you spoke about the woman who saved my life while you plotted to steal my estate." The colour drained from Margaret's face as comprehension dawned, her carefully constructed facade crumbling into genuine terror as she realized that her unconscious brother had been a silent witness to her every betrayal, and she opened her mouth to offer some desperate explanation, but Henry raised one trembling hand to silence her. "You will leave Ravenscroft Hall today," he continued with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "You will retire to the Dower House in Cornwall, and you will remain there until I decide whether to forgive you, which I assure you will not be soon." And Margaret fled the room in tears that were finally genuine, while Mrs. Fleming watched her go with grim satisfaction before turning to her master with the first smile she had worn in weeks. "Now then, Your Grace," the housekeeper said briskly, "shall I fetch Miss Whitmore before that aunt of hers bundles her into a carriage and spirits her away to London?" And Henry nodded with desperate gratitude as he clutched Eleanor's book of poetry to his chest like a talisman against the terrible possibility that he might be too late. Eleanor was halfway down the main staircase with her packed trunk already loaded onto Lady Beatrice's waiting carriage when Mrs. Fleming intercepted her with a breathless urgency that stopped her mid-step, the housekeeper's weathered face flushed from running, and her cap askew as she grasped Eleanor's arm with surprising strength and said the words that turned Eleanor's entire world inside out. "He is awake, Miss Whitmore, and he is asking for you, demanding you, in fact, and he will not rest until you come to him, so please I beg you return to the master chamber before that stubborn man does himself an injury trying to rise from his bed." The walk back up those stairs felt like a journey of 1,000 miles, each step heavier than the last, as Eleanor's mind raced through every confession she had whispered into the darkness of that sick room, every secret she had spilled believing herself safe in the presence of an unconscious man, every foolish declaration of love that now hung in the air between them, like an accusation she could never take back. When she pushed open the door to his chamber and saw Henry Ashworth sitting upright against a mountain of pillows, his grey-blue eyes alert and focused and fixed upon her face with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs, she felt the ground shift beneath her feet and understood with terrible clarity that he knew everything. "You are awake," she managed to say, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper, as her hands began to tremble so violently that she clasped them together to still their shaking, and his eyes never left hers as he nodded slowly and spoke in a voice still rough from weeks of silence, but growing stronger with each word. "I have been awake," he said gently, "for far longer than anyone realized, and I heard every story you told me, Eleanor, every secret you shared, every word you spoke when you believed I could not hear, and his use of her Christian name sent a shock through her body that made her step backward toward the door as though she might flee from the weight of what he was revealing. The mortification that flooded through her was so complete and so devastating that she could not meet his gaze, her eyes dropping to the floor as her cheeks burned with a shame so profound it seemed to consume her entirely, and she turned toward the door with some half-formed excuse about Lady Beatrice waiting already on her lips when his voice stopped her. "Please," he said, and there was something in that single word that made her pause with her hand on the door handle, something raw and real and desperate that cut through her panic like sunlight through storm clouds. "Do not leave me now when I have only just found the ability to tell you what your voice meant to me in that darkness, what your presence meant, what you mean." She turned back to face him and saw the poetry book she had left as a gift clutched in his hands. Saw her own packed trunk visible through the doorway, waiting to carry her away to a life without him, and she made herself stay, though she chose the chair furthest from his bed and sat with her back rigid and her hands still trembling in her lap. The afternoon of November 25th found Eleanor seated in the library of Ravenscroft Hall, wearing a new dress of sage green that Lady Beatrice had pressed upon her with unprecedented enthusiasm, the soft fabric feeling foreign against skin accustomed to grey wool and brown serviceable cotton, and across from her in a leather chair that matched her own sat Henry Ashworth with his bandaged leg propped upon an ottoman and a cane resting against the arm of his seat, his grey-blue eyes watching her with an attention that still made her want to flee even as something deeper made her stay. The 4 days since his revelation had passed in a strange dance of cautious conversation and careful distance, Eleanor returning each afternoon to sit with him in this room that felt like neutral territory, neither his sick room where she had spilled her secrets nor the servants' quarters where she properly belonged, and slowly the burning shame that had consumed her began to cool into something more complicated as she discovered that the Duke of Ravenscroft was not content to simply receive her stories, but insisted upon offering his own in return. "I was 7 when my mother died," Henry said quietly, his voice still bearing traces of hoarseness, but growing stronger each day. "And my father retreated so completely into his grief that I became invisible in my own home, a ghost haunting the corridors of Ravenscroft, while servants whispered that the young master was cold and strange and would never learn to feel as normal children do." Eleanor's hand stilled in her lap as she listened, recognizing in his words an echo of her own isolation. And when he described the wall he had built around himself to survive a childhood of neglect, she understood for the first time that his reputation for coldness had been armor rather than nature, protection rather than preference. "You spoke to me as though I were human," he continued, leaning forward in his chair with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Everyone else who visited my sick room spoke of me as though I were already dead, or discussed my estate, as though I were merely an obstacle to their ambitions. But you told me stories and shared your dreams and treated me as a man worth knowing even when you believed I could not hear." She wanted to protest that she had only been filling silence, that her confessions had been weakness rather than gift. But something in his expression stopped her, and she found herself asking instead about the books that lined these shelves, whether he had truly read them all, and his face transformed with the first genuine smile she had witnessed as he described his childhood habit of hiding in this very room to escape his father's disappointed gaze. When she laughed at his description of the elderly butler who had smuggled him biscuits and adventure novels, the sound surprised them both. And Philip Sinclair, who had been quietly reviewing documents at a desk in the corner, looked up with an expression of such profound satisfaction that Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks. She still could not quite believe that this was real, that a duke would look at plain, overlooked Eleanor Whitmore with such warmth in his eyes. But as the winter light faded and Henry asked if she would return tomorrow, she found herself saying yes before doubt could stop her. The days that followed their first shared laughter in the library became a pattern Eleanor could scarcely have imagined in the long grey years before the accident, each afternoon bringing her to Ravenscroft Hall, where Henry waited in his chair by the fire, with books set aside and questions ready. His grey-blue eyes lighting with something that looked remarkably like joy whenever she appeared in the doorway. And though she still could not quite believe this was happening to plain, overlooked Eleanor Whitmore, she found herself beginning to trust that his interest was genuine, that his attentiveness was not performance or pity, but something far more precious and far more terrifying. He asked her about the stories she had told him in the darkness, wanting to know how she had invented them, where the images came from, what worlds lived inside her mind that she had never shared with anyone before. And when she tried to deflect with self-deprecation, he stopped her with a gentle firmness that made her breath catch, saying that her imagination was a gift and that the woman who had created the tale of the Stone Prince possessed a mind he found endlessly fascinating. She learned in turn that he had spent his childhood reading every book in this very library to escape the silence of a house where grief had consumed his father so completely that the living child became invisible, that he had taught himself Latin from these shelves because tutors came and went, and only books remained constant, that the reputation for coldness that preceded him everywhere had begun as a shield and calcified into a prison from which he had believed there was no escape, until a woman sat beside his sickbed and spoke to him as though he were worth knowing. Philip Sinclair had taken to finding excuses to visit during their afternoon conversations, his knowing smile suggesting he saw exactly what was unfolding between them, and Lady Beatrice had transformed from a woman who viewed Eleanor as a useful servant into an aunt who suddenly remembered their blood connection with remarkable enthusiasm, arriving at Ravenscroft with new dresses, adisses, and unsolicited advice about the importance of posture and the proper way to address a duke. But it was the small moments that undid Eleanor's carefully constructed defences, the way Henry remembered every detail she had shared during his supposed unconsciousness, and wove them into their conversations as proof that he had truly heard her, the way he asked about her mother's locket, and listened with such genuine attention when she described the miniature portrait inside, the way he never once made her feel foolish for having confessed her love to a man she believed could not hear, instead treating those whispered words as the precious gift they had been, offered without expectation of return. When December arrived and the first heavy snows made travel between the estates difficult, Henry suggested that Lady Beatrice and Eleanor should simply stay at Ravenscroft until the roads cleared. And though propriety demanded Eleanor sleep in the guest wing far from his chambers, she found herself counting the hours until she could return to the library where he waited, his cane set aside and his hand extended to help her to her chair, and she began to understand that somewhere between the telling of tales to a silent room and the sharing of truths in fire-lit afternoons, she had stopped being invisible and started being seen. The morning of December 5th dawned clear and bright with winter sunlight streaming through the frost-etched windows of Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor found herself standing before the mirror in her guest chamber, studying her reflection with an uncertainty she had not felt since girlhood. For today, Henry had asked her to walk with him in the winter garden, and though his leg still required the cane, and their pace would be slow. She understood that this invitation represented something significant, a step beyond the firelit safety of the library, into a world where others might see them together and draw conclusions that still terrified her, with their implications. She wore the sage-green dress again, because she had noticed how his eyes softened when he saw her in it, and this small vanity felt like a revolution for a woman who had spent years deliberately choosing colors that helped her fade into walls and shadows. And as she descended the stairs to meet him in the entrance hall, she found him already waiting with his cane in one hand and a woolen scarf in the other that he held out to her with a smile that made her heart stutter in her chest. The garden paths had been cleared of snow by diligent servants, and they walked slowly between hedges trimmed into geometric shapes now softened by white powder, their breath forming small clouds in the cold air, as Henry spoke of his plans for spring planting and asked her opinion on whether roses or peonies would better suit the southern border, as though her preferences in flowers were matters of genuine importance. And Eleanor found herself answering honestly rather than deferring to his judgment, as she would have done mere weeks ago. When they reached the stone bench at the garden's center, he lowered himself carefully and patted the space beside him, and she sat close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, feeling the warmth of him even through layers of winter clothing. And he told her that Philip had returned to London to finalize certain legal matters, but would return within the fortnight with documents that Henry hoped would please her, though he would say no more despite her curious questions. Lady Beatrice appeared at a window above them and waved enthusiastically in a manner that made Eleanor flush with embarrassment, but Henry only laughed and waved back as though her aunt's transparent matchmaking delighted rather than mortified him. And when Eleanor tried to apologize for the lack of subtlety, he took her gloved hand in his and said that he had spent 32 years being subtle and reserved and cold, and that he found himself quite done with all of it, that the woman who had told him stories in the darkness deserved a man willing to declare his intentions before windows and aunts and anyone else who cared to watch. The winter sun caught the silver threads in his dark hair and illuminated the strong lines of his face, and Eleanor thought that she had never seen anything so beautiful as this proud duke holding her hand in a frozen garden and speaking of intentions as though plain, overlooked Eleanor Whitmore were worthy of such declarations. The days following their walk in the winter garden brought a shift that Eleanor felt in her very bones, a settling of something that had been restless within her for so long she had forgotten what stillness felt like, and she found herself spending more hours at Ravenscroft Hall than at her aunt's residence, drawn back again and again by the pull of grey-blue eyes and a voice that spoke her name as though it were something precious. Henry's strength returned steadily now, his leg healing well enough that Dr. Ferrars pronounced him fit to walk short distances without the cane, though he still kept it close for longer excursions, and Eleanor watched with quiet wonder as the man who had lain so still in that great bed transformed day by day into someone vital and warm and achingly present. They had fallen into a rhythm of shared meals and afternoon readings and evening conversations that stretched late into the night. And though propriety demanded chaperones, Lady Beatrice had taken to falling asleep in her chair by the fire with suspicious regularity, leaving them to talk in low voices about everything and nothing while the flames crackled and the snow fell soft against the window panes. On December the 10th, Henry asked Eleanor to tell him a new story, not one she had created during his silence, but something fresh, something born from the hope she was learning to feel rather than the loneliness she had carried for so long. And she found herself weaving a tale of a woman who discovered that the walls she had built around her heart were not fortresses but prisons, that safety and happiness were not the same thing, that sometimes the bravest act was simply to believe she deserved to be loved. He listened with that intensity she had come to crave, his eyes never leaving her face, and when she finished, he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand without gloves between them for the first time, his palm warm and slightly rough against her fingers, and he told her that she had saved him, not once but twice, first with her voice in the darkness, and now with her willingness to stay, despite every reason she had constructed for running. Mrs. Fleming brought tea and pretended not to notice their joined hands. Her weathered face creased with a smile she did not bother to hide, and Eleanor thought of all the years she had spent believing herself unworthy of notice, all the grey dresses and downcast eyes and careful invisibility, and she marvelled at how thoroughly this man had dismantled the careful architecture of her diminishment simply by seeing her, simply by listening, simply by refusing to let her disappear back into the shadows from which she had emerged, to find him broken on the moor. When Philip returned from London on December the 12th with a leather satchel full of documents and a smile that suggested secrets, Eleanor noticed the meaningful glances exchanged between the two men and felt her heart begin to race with something that might have been terror or might have been hope. For she was learning slowly that those two feelings were sometimes impossible to distinguish. The evening of December 15th arrived wrapped in the particular silence that only deep winter can bring, the kind of hush that makes every word spoken feel weighted with significance, and Eleanor sat in the library at Ravenscroft Hall with her hands folded in her lap and her heart beating so rapidly she feared Henry might hear it from his chair across the fire, where he sat watching her with an expression she had learned to recognize as the one he wore when marshalling courage for something important. Philip had departed that afternoon after a long private conversation with Henry in the study, and Lady Beatrice had retired early with suspicious enthusiasm, leaving Eleanor alone with the Duke in a room that suddenly felt both vast and impossibly intimate, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the spines of hundreds of books that had witnessed so much of their unlikely story unfold. Henry rose from his chair with only the slightest reliance on his cane now, crossing the distance between them with deliberate steps until he stood before her, and then, to her astonishment, he lowered himself carefully to one knee on the thick carpet, his grey-blue eyes fixed upon her face with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs and left her momentarily incapable of speech or movement or thought, beyond the thundering awareness that this moment would divide her life forever into before and after. He took her trembling hand in both of his and spoke her name. Eleanor, just that, letting it hang in the firelit air, like a prayer or a promise. And then he told her that in 38 days of darkness, she had given him stories that illuminated the shadows of his soul, that her voice had been the thread connecting him to life when everything in him wanted to surrender to the void, that he had fallen in love with her mind and her heart, and her stubborn courage, long before he could open his eyes to see the face he now knew he wanted to wake to. every morning for whatever years God granted him. He told her that Philip had brought the special license from London, that everything was arranged if she would have him, that he knew the world would whisper about the duke who married his nurse, the spinster who somehow ensnared a fortune, but he found he cared nothing for the whispers of a society that had failed to see the treasure hiding in plain sight among them all these years. He asked her then, simply and directly, without flowery speeches or elaborate declarations, whether she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, his duchess, his partner in whatever adventures awaited them, and Eleanor felt the tears spilling down her cheeks, even as she laughed at the absurdity and wonder of it all, this impossible turn in a life she had believed destined for grey obscurity. And she said yes, yes, 1,000 times, yes, and Henry rose to pull her into his arms and kiss her properly for the first time while the fire crackled its approval, and somewhere in the house Mrs. Fleming was certainly weeping with joy, because nothing that happened at Ravenscroft Hall ever truly escaped her notice. The wedding took place on December 20th in the small stone chapel at Ravenscroft Hall, where generations of Ashworths had spoken their vows beneath vaulted ceilings that had witnessed centuries of joy and sorrow and everything between, and Eleanor stood at the altar in a gown of cream silk that Lady Beatrice had commissioned from London with such haste that the seamstresses must have worked through every night to complete it, the fabric catching the candlelight from dozens of tapers that transformed the ancient space into something from the very stories she had whispered to a man she believed could not hear her. Henry waited for her at the end of the aisle, with Philip standing steady at his side, his cane set aside for this moment, though she could see the slight tension in his stance that spoke of the effort it cost him, and his grey-blue eyes held such tenderness as she walked toward him that Eleanor felt the last of her old doubts crumble like autumn leaves beneath winter snow, leaving only the clean, bright certainty that this impossible thing was truly happening, that she was truly wanted, that the years of invisibility had been merely the long, dark prelude to a dawn she had never dared to imagine. Dr. Ferrars attended as a guest rather than physician for once, seated beside Mrs. Fleming, who wept openly into a handkerchief she had embroidered herself with the ducal crest in anticipation of this very day. And even Lady Beatrice dabbed at her eyes, though Eleanor suspected her aunt's tears owed as much to the triumph of securing a duke for her overlooked niece as to any romantic sentiment. The vicar spoke the ancient words that bound them together in the eyes of God and law and society, and when Henry slipped the ring onto Eleanor's finger, a band of gold set with a single sapphire that matched his eyes, his hands trembled slightly, and she realized with a rush of protective love that he was nervous too, this powerful man who had heard her most secret confessions and loved her still, who had fought his way back from the darkness with her voice as his guide. They spoke their vows in voices that carried clear through the chapel, Eleanor's steady, despite the tears that slipped down her cheeks, Henry's rough with emotion that he no longer tried to hide. And when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry kissed her with a thoroughness that made Lady Beatrice cough pointedly and Philip laugh aloud, Eleanor thought of the woman she had been just 2 months ago, walking alone on the moor with nothing but her stories for company, and she marvelled at how completely a single moment could alter the course of a life. They signed the register together, her new name flowing from her pen in ink that would dry into permanence, Eleanor Ashworth, Duchess of Ravenscroft, titles that still felt like borrowed garments she was not quite certain she deserved to wear, though Henry caught her expression and squeezed her hand as if to say that she deserved everything, that she had always deserved everything, that the world had simply been too blind to see what he had recognized in the darkness when her voice was all he had. The wedding breakfast that followed gathered the small party in the great dining hall, where Mrs. Fleming had worked miracles with the winter stores. creating a feast that belied the season's scarcity. And Eleanor sat at Henry's right hand in the place of honor that still felt borrowed despite the ring now warming on her finger, and the new name that belonged to her by law and love and every vow spoken before God that morning. The conversation flowed more easily than she had expected, Philip's wit drawing laughter from even Lady Beatrice, Dr. Ferrars sharing stories of Henry's remarkable recovery with the enthusiasm of a man who had witnessed something he could not quite explain through medical science alone. And through it all, Henry's hand found hers beneath the table, his thumb tracing circles on her palm in a private language of touch that made her cheeks flush and her heart race with anticipation of the night to come. When the meal concluded and the guests began to take their leave, Philip clasping Henry's shoulder with wordless emotion, and Lady Beatrice pressing powdered kisses to Eleanor's cheeks while whispering instructions that made the new Duchess blush crimson, Eleanor found herself standing alone with her husband in the entrance hall of what was now her home, the great doors closing behind the last carriage, and leaving them in a silence that felt nothing like the silences she had known before, this one full of promise rather than emptiness, of beginning rather than endless waiting. Henry led her through the halls she had walked so many times as nurse and storyteller, past the chamber where she had poured out her heart to a man she believed could not hear, up the grand staircase where portraits of Ashworth ancestors watched their passage with painted eyes that seemed almost to approve, until they reached the door to the Duchess's chambers that adjoined his own, rooms that had stood empty for decades and now blazed with firelight and candles that Mrs. Fleming had clearly prepared with romantic intent. He paused at the threshold and turned to her, his grey-blue eyes searching her face with the same intensity she remembered from his first conscious moments, and he told her that she need not be frightened, that they had all the time in the world, that he had waited 38 days, unable to move or speak, and he could wait longer still if she needed time to know that this was real and permanent and true. But Eleanor found that she did not want to wait, that she had spent 28 years waiting for a life that would never come, and she was done with waiting now that life had finally found her in the most unexpected form imaginable. So she rose on her toes and kissed him with all the courage she had discovered in herself during those long nights of storytelling. And Henry made a sound against her lips that was part laughter and part prayer and entirely love, and he swept her into his arms despite the cane he should have been using, carrying her across the threshold into the chambers that would witness the beginning of their married life together.